All right, guys, let's go ahead and jump into it. We have a really exciting session for you today. The first portion of time is going to be focused on our presentation with our speakers, and then we are going to hold the remainder of the time for questions. You may post your questions in the Q&A chat, and at the end of the session, we'll go ahead and call out select questions for our speakers to address. This webinar is being brought to you in collaboration with the University of Minnesota's Design of Medical Devices Conference, the University of Michigan's Archimedes Center for Medical Device Security, and finally, our speakers, who are the ones who are really making this event truly possible, from the DEF CON Biohacking Village. For those of you who are not familiar, the Biohacking Village at DEF CON was developed in 2014, starting out in a small space with the goal to bring the forefront of citizen science and biomedical security to the world's biggest hacker conference. Today, the Village brings together thousands of attendees each year, including their partners, such as the FDA and Mayo Clinic, and it has become a primary conduit for the healthcare community to engage positively and proactively with security researchers. The speakers today are Nina Ali. Nina has worked in the healthcare, tech, and security industry for 16 years, and she is the executive director of the Biohacking Village at DEF CON. Her degrees are held in biomedical informatics and translational medicine. Nina is working on a diagnostic microfluidics device being incubated at the NYU Veterans Future Lab. She also has worked as a scientist in residence at the New York Academy of Sciences and has served in the US Marine Corps. And then we also have Beau Woods. Beau has over a decade in IT and security. He is a Cyber Safety Innovation Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a leader with the I Am the Cavalry Grassroots Initiative, founder and CEO of Strategos Security, and sits on the board of several nonprofits. His work bridges the gap between the security research and public policy communities to ensure connected technology that can impact life and safety is worthy of our trust. So thank you so much, Nina and Beau, for presenting to our group today, and I'll go ahead and pass the mic off to you, Nina.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So to start, I'm going to share my screen. So full disclosure, I finished this report, this PowerPoint about an hour and a half ago, and I wanted it to be at a forefront of this conference because it may have some impact on you in the future. So I titled this Reimagine, Reinvent, and Recover. As Sarah said, I'm Nina Ali. I am the executive director of the Biohacking Village, and just a little more background on me. I did serve in the Marine Corps, working in strategic intelligence. I have worked at Sloan Kettering. I'm also did a lot of work in electronic medical records and IoT connected devices. I'm on the strategic advisory board for the Diabetic Society of Digital Medicine. I work for the DoD on occasion, and I am an affiliate at Penn State. So I took a lot of consideration into giving this talk because I wanted to focus on COVID, but focus on you, more importantly, you the conglomerate. So what has COVID taught us? But more importantly, what did we learn from all of this? And what actions do we need to take from it? So why did I think it was important to bring this all to you? Because my insight was requested by the Department of Defense to flesh out some of these things that are going to be at the forefront and start putting them in motion. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. This has been a weird situation for everyone, literally the entire world. As Pretty Woman put it so eloquently, this has been a slippery little sucker. Some things that I wanted to talk about for your mind spaces. I may not have the answers for everything. I admittedly don't, but it's something that I wanted to bring up again so that you guys would have time to think about it. Emergency usage, authorizations, the medical supply chain, data security and hackery, vertical integrations, telehealth partnerships, leadership, and centralized governance. So the call for action at the end of this or during it, happy to also have conversations away from this, are to take these things into consideration for your practices. So we have not reached a steady state for healthcare. Hospitals are still treating patients with symptoms and devices are still insecure. So thinking of ways forward to move these things along. So for the FDA emergency use authorization, there have been 22 diagnostic and antibody devices that were okayed for EAU, for emergency use authorization. And that was brought about by you guys. So thank you so much for all of that. They were sent out into the wild to collect data and to bring that data back, report it back, normalize it, adjust it as necessary, make changes, and put them back out so that they can help the communities test for positive and negative results of patients. So we're gonna have to redo those and send those back into the wild. But after this, people are still gonna have to go through the normalized settings for usage not under the emergency use authorization. So that's something else to think about while all of this is going on. So a lot of this is to put these things on your radar as things to work on in future state. So medical supply chain, building the Amazon of healthcare. So if what we started to realize when COVID happened was that we do not maintain a lot of our own resources here. We go overseas for those things. So one idea that was brought about was becoming more independent and dependent on ourselves. So with that said, with medical devices and vaccines and et cetera, where would we start all of these manufacturing? For example, the vaccinations, where do we get the syringes, the glass containers, the caps, sterilization, the cold chain storage for these vaccines, and how do we distribute them in mass? As far as the immunity and the antibody research, how do we stand up new facilities for that sort of production? Where would they go? How much would it cost? And how much would the human resources, the build, and the sciences, so the build doesn't teach them, and the sciences for all of these things, how would we get that together? As well as the components for the sourcing. So again, the scientific knowledge and the additives for the vaccinations, tests, devices. There, at the beginning of COVID, there was a sort of agreement between the hacker community of, we will stand down for a certain amount of time so that people could work through this, or we could start working through it. Worldwide hackers, worldwide security researchers got together and created the CTI League, of which Beau is one of the seminal components, and teamed up for the greater good being that they started helping the medical device manufacturers, the health delivery organizations, ambulatory centers, so that if something was going on within their servers, their electronics, the hackers would come in and help them get through that if they didn't have the resources for it. So I believe Beau may be talking about that later as well. Telehealth was not necessarily at the forefront before COVID, but because now it's a great start. So how can we do more with getting patients to understand how telehealth works? Also, how do we get the physicians to understand how telehealth works, and how do we implement more of the touchless patient care? How do we get more internet infrastructure where it's needed so that we can start providing this telehealth? How do we get physician knowledge and patient knowledge up and literacy up so we can create boundless interactions between them, where we have to create comprehensive medical applications for the phone or for the computer? And how do we ramp up that instruction and usage of those things during COVID and after? Also, during COVID, a lot of partnerships were created. Medical industry device makers, security researchers, hackers, the maker community, citizen scientists, venture capital, government, everybody got together, and it was beautiful. And we had this borderless community of folks working toward one goal. And I feel like we need to continue having that. So all of the nation, all of the world, people came together out of necessity, but there was no ego. And again, because it was borderless, everybody shared the concern, everyone shared the resources for it. So how do we continue this after COVID? I want to say is over, but after we've progressed more after COVID. Additionally, there needs to be a bit more leadership as far as what country or entity will take charge of this pandemic itself, or at least be the guiding light for this with technical capital and governance. We also need a bit more of the centralized governance for this. So it's a healthcare community effort. There are various governing bodies that are giving us orders, and we are out there working on those, but they may be coming from different standpoints. My belief system is that they need to come under one auspice so that we as an industry can have one place to look for complete layout of what is expected of us and how we can succeed. Additionally, localizing the vertical integration of how we function, where we are in charge of the entire cycle, from thought processes all the way down to manufacturing and distribution. So the hashtag I'm going to use for this is the full stack biotechnologist, which was coined by Steve Lewis. That is essentially what we all need to become so that we can get through COVID and we can then get the rest of healthcare a bit more integrated. So for me, my takeaway from all of this is that our execution of this must match our intent, and we have to have a tactical shift in response so that we can finish this together. So this is my humaning side of this. We are all in this together, including the crisis fatigue mode, which I'm very much positive a lot of us are working on. We are in a masterclass of discovery, and I use that extremely broadly, of self-discovery and medical device discovery, healthcare discovery. What we find needs to go into some repository somewhere where we can start utilizing those ideas and completing them and moving them forward into things that are tangible and can work for healthcare delivery organizations, medical device manufacturers, and patients, so that we can move together on this. And I talk really exponentially fast. I think that was like 10 minutes. So I'm going to pass this off to Beau because he's next and he's awesome. Mr. Beau Woods? Or maybe not.
Have to find the unmute button if I want to use it there.
See, that's a bingo already.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I know. Okay.
All right. Turning over my slides, and I will start screen sharing. All right. Hopefully you can all see my slides now. Thanks for the overview on COVID, Nina. I think that some of the work that's going on right now is just completely fascinating to me. I'll get into my background. I don't have a traditional healthcare background. While I have worked at a hospital, a healthcare organization, I've worked with many medical device makers, the FDA. I come to this through a cybersecurity lens. So I've been a security practitioner most of my career. Started off, worked my first 3 years at a hospital, found myself working a lot, not just on the clinical systems as a IT security practitioner, but also on medical devices when malware would get on them, when we were trying to put anti-malware software on them, and they would accidentally flag on medical device software, when viruses would go around and hit medical devices just as indiscriminately as they hit any other device, any server or workstation in our system. So spent about 3 years doing that, balancing my time about 90-10 between the clinical side, the non-medical device side, versus the medical device side. I, as the screen notes here. I'm affiliated with a number of different organizations in my background. So Nina talked a little bit about the biohacking village. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that. I run the device lab there, which is a safe space for medical device makers, security researchers, the FDA, hospitals, doctors, anyone in the broader healthcare security community to come in and participate and work together with each other. And I have a little bit more detail on that later, but it's a really, really good program to help keep a heartbeat of the medical security industry, if you will, and work a lot there with the medical device makers such as BD, Siemens, Philips, and others. I Am the Cavalry is a global grassroots initiative from the security research community. We started in 2013 in order to we say raise the alarm without being alarmist, in order to help preserve the trust that we have in critical systems like medical devices, like cars, like airplanes, trains, industrial control systems. And we've had a lot of traction over the last 7 years, bringing together the public policy community, security researcher, industry, industry associations, and others. I spent a year at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as an entrepreneur in residence, working on a program called the Pre-Cert program for software as a medical device. Some of you may have worked on it in the past or be familiar with it. And finally, I'm a Cyber Safety Innovation Fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I focus on the intersection of national security and cybersecurity, as well as global security. So I'm a fan of sci-fi, and there'll be some sci-fi elements in this talk today. I want to just give a brief background of where we came from, use some historical information that probably goes back farther than most of you are thinking you'd hear on this talk today. Where we are, which is more the contemporary within the last 10 years, and then where we're going. What I see is 10 to 15 years out, potentially, but you can already see the precursors of it now. And then I want to leave you with some tools to equip you to go out and make the future that you want to see, not just one that might be predetermined or the direction that we're currently going, which I think is good, but maybe not moving as quickly as we need it to. All right, so where did we come from? I'm kind of an amateur historian. I like to read historical novels, history of catastrophes, disasters, going back all the way, to Roman times, to pre-Roman times, to the Egyptians. And one of the things that you tend to see over and over again is that there's a lot of patterns in history. I forget who it was. Somebody said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot. And so as I look back through these historical documents, I'm always struck by where it rhymes. And so I'd like to take you on a quick tour of some of the places where I think it rhymes. Just going through one instance in time in the early to late 1800s. Now, this is a picture of London looking down at the Thames like Narcissus and seeing all the things in the Thames that London loved. The Thames, if you don't know at this time, was really dirty. I don't know how clearly this picture is coming through in the slideshow, but you can see in the background, there's a lot of smokestacks with industrial pollutions, coal burning plants, the runoff from any kinds of industrial processes. There's stuff floating in the river. It's really kind of gross. If you see photographs or detailed etchings of this time, the river was really kind of a cesspool. But for London at the time, that represented progress. The dirtier the river got was largely because the city was getting more populous. It was largely because industry was turning up, going faster, because there was more money flowing in and out of the city. So it was kind of seen as a point of pride. But of course, we know it was not a point of pride, because there was so much detritus in the water. If people fell in, they were highly likely to die. You know, people knew that disease came from the river generally. They didn't know how, but they knew that things were happening there. The predominant theory was that it was the smell. In 1858, in the summer of 1858, there was a moment that they called the Great Stench, where Parliament had to be disbanded over summer because the smell was so great. And they were worried that all these parliamentarians were going to get sick and die from this unclean smell, the miasma theory of disease. You know, some people thought it was electromagnetism. That's what made people sick. This newish science that had sprung up maybe 100 years ago. Some people thought it was the smell of the river. Some people thought it was being unclean, or some people thought that being poor in itself was what caused people to die. No less an expert than Michael Faraday in 1855 studied this issue. Michael Faraday, if you don't know, is one of the leading scientists in electromagnetism. And he recognized that there was something with the river that was causing people to get sick. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he had suspicions. He knew where it was coming from roughly. He also knew that that the consequences were severe. He said, if we neglect this subject, we cannot expect to do so with impunity, nor ought we to be surprised if, before many years are over, a hot season gives us sad proof of the folly of our carelessness. So he was ringing the bell. He was ringing the alarm, saying, we've got to do something about the river. We've got to clean it up. Now, the idea of these little creatures living in the water was not a new one. The microscope was invented in the 1600s. One of the first things to be looked at was a drop of water. It was seen as a curiosity. It was seen as there's a whole little world happening underneath our noses in the Thames. And what are these little creatures? It's crazy. I don't know what they are, but they're really interesting. Some people started to study them. But at the time, you know, you'd have to be an idiot or you'd have to be crazy to believe that these wee little beasties, as they called them, could cause harm. But at least one guy did. This is a picture of Ignaz Semmelweis, who was an Austrian physician, lived in Vienna at the time. And he noticed that his patients would die if he went from one patient to another and another without washing his hands. He noticed that if he washed his hands, they didn't die at quite as high a rate. So he advocated that everyone wash their hands, and he had some really astringent products that he would use to wash his hands. But not only was he doing it, he was going around to his fellow doctors and saying, look, there's a problem here. We need to really do something about this. And they thought he was kind of crazy. And in fact, they thought he was so crazy to believe that the dirt that comes off of your hands, the creatures in that dirt, could cause people to be harmed. So they put him in a mental institution where he died in around 1865, I believe. Because these ideas were so heretical, because they were so outside of what the doctors of the time would think of, even though today we truly believe in the germ theory of disease. At that time, you would have to be crazy to believe in the germ theory of disease. It is until going back to London, during some of these cholera outbreaks, there was a guy named John Snow, not that John Snow, but he was just a local guy who was going around, excuse me. And he noticed that people tended to die in patterns in London. And so he started mapping these out. And this is one of the first infographics, as we would call them today. This is called the Ghost Map. And there's a really fascinating book. If you want to deep dive on this era of history, you can read the Ghost Map. And what he showed in these maps is that the number of people who died could be traced back to proximity to a certain water source. So in other words, all of these people were getting their water from the same place, even if they were smelling the same foul Thames air that was coming off the water. Whether they were farther or closer to the river, they would die around these water sources. And so what he did is during one of these outbreaks, when he was convinced this was the thing, he got the county to give him permission to go and take the pump handle off of the well. And there's some doubt as to whether or not that act stopped the outbreak or stopped a future outbreak from occurring. Certainly after that, you saw that around that area, the number of cases of cholera went down very, very quickly. And so the London physicians and London scientists of the time, some of the radicals, some of the ones who saw this evidence and said, well, we can't do nothing, they started emulating what John Snow was doing. They started going around and making sure that the pump handles were taken off whenever there was a cholera outbreak. And eventually this became the germ theory of disease that now we all recognize works. But to clean up the city of London was incredibly costly, incredibly expensive. This is some of the sewer works that were going on. It cost many billions of pounds in today's currency to fix all the sewers in London, which, by the way, these same sewer systems are still what exist in London. They did a really good job of fixing these. They had to invent new forms of engineering based on the science that they knew in order to build these sewers in a way that would work well. And it worked really, really well. But another thing that most of the sources credit is they say that it was the role of amateurs and of people who weren't necessarily insiders in the science, who were some of the most important figures in this transition to the germ theory of disease. Because the established science, the established scientists, the scientists royal, in fact, for the country of England, all believed in this one prevailing paradigm that safety, that human life couldn't be impacted by these tiny invisible things that you couldn't see. So I hope you enjoyed that history lesson. If you didn't, then thank your teachers for being great. They're way better than what I can possibly do. Now I want to shift to where we are today. And this will be a little bit of an aged retrospective, going back to about a decade ago. And if anybody recognizes this guy, this is Jay Radcliffe. He is a security researcher. He is also a diabetic and a father. And his story goes, sometime he noticed that a couple of times his insulin pump had given him incorrect doses of insulin. After he changed his batteries, it worked differently than he expected. Sometime randomly, it gave him too little or too much. And I said, if that's what can happen with accidents, what could happen with an adversary? And so, using his security researcher background, using his engineering training, he started poking at these devices. And he found that actually they were pretty insecure, and that he could trigger harm through connecting over radio frequency signals. So he didn't even have to be too close to someone, within 100 yards or so. He and another researcher, the late Barnaby Jack, also did this and demonstrated that this was possible. Told the manufacturers kind of said, only an idiot to believe that these invisible software bugs can kill people. And didn't really work with them, with those researchers very closely. So they released their results to the world. And this became some of the early Black Hat talks, the Black Hat conference, that really caused the FDA to stand up and take notice and say, wait a minute, we believe the medical device manufacturers that they design these devices safely. At the same time, we see this evidence where it's possible to trigger unsafe conditions in these. So there's something happening here that we don't quite understand yet. And the FDA, to their credit, said, we want to learn. We don't want to make a snap judgment. We don't want to potentially endanger people for years or decades because we made the wrong decision. We don't want to fall too far on the side of more security or too far on the side of security has to subordinate to safety in every case. So they underwent a several years process of trying to figure this out by bringing these different groups together. The medical device makers, the security researchers, hospitals, patients, doctors, anyone that they could think of that could potentially give them input. They brought them together. And so Jay and myself and several others went to the FDA a couple of times in 2013, 2014. And we kind of gave them a little bit of a primer on who are security researchers? Why would we possibly care about what they are finding? Aren't they all just criminals? And we spent a couple of days over the course of a couple of years just walking through these things. So the primer you're going to get in the next 2 minutes is woefully incomplete, and I apologize for that. If you want to talk more, I'm always happy to. But I want to give 5 kind of archetypes of security researchers to help you have a better picture in mind of who these security researchers really are, so that you have a little bit more complexity in your understanding, a little bit more nuance, to hopefully think about them in a way that is helpful for you to categorize folks so that you can work with them better, or ignore them better should you so choose. So I like to say that there's 5 different motivations or 5 types. Really, there's as many as there are in the human condition. Everybody's motivated by something different, some different combination. Most people in the security research community have 1 or 2 of these, sometimes 3 that primarily drive them. But this is a good set of buckets to think in. And then, going by the 80-20 rule, you'll probably capture most of the security researchers. So the first bucket I want to talk about is protect. These are people who they just want to make things better. These are people who go out and buy devices out of their own pocket, put them on their table, work on them for a couple of months, and then once they find potential issues, they'll report them to the manufacturer and never tell anybody else, right? Or give the manufacturer all the time they need to fix them. These are people who are motivated by just doing good, doing public good, helping protect patients and others. The second group is puzzlers, and the puzzlers are the curious. Most security researchers started out being very, very curious, and this drives them to investigate things. They want to know what's going on. They want to see how the machinery works inside. They're just going to pull things apart. When they find something, they may or may not report it. They may or may not talk about it publicly. They're just curious at heart. Then there's a group of researchers who are driven by pride and prestige, and being able to be, known as the person who works on medical devices, or being known as the person who found a really amazing bug. This drives them to excel. It drives them to be better. It pushes the state of knowledge further, faster than it would have happened before. And these people are really valuable in the ecosystem because they prevent stagnation. They will document what they do so that they make sure it's known, but also so that other people can repeat it and check their work. So there's quite a few folks in the research community that have that as one of their motivations. There's also profit or payment. You may look at this and see bug bounty hunters, people who spend all of their time finding flaws in websites to report them because there's a bounty that the company will pay them if they find a bug. These might be consultants who are paid by companies to do investigations, to look at medical devices, to look at websites, to look at products, and find issues so that they can be fixed early in the life cycle. These might be people who are professionals in some other manner. Maybe they work at a hospital, and in their spare time, they use the skills that they know from a hospital or from an auto manufacturer to do testing on cars or on medical devices. And so they have these skills from their profit motivation, and they put those back into usually their education at work. Then you have protest or patriot. These are people who they're ideologically driven. They do what they do for a cause. Now, these might be people who are former law enforcement, current former law enforcement, or current and former military. Folks like Nina, who get into this because they're driven by a sense of wanting to protect the nation, to protect soldiers, to protect citizens. And that's very understandable. Or they might see injustices in the world. And you get a number of security researchers who go and work on things like Syrian disinformation campaigns or attempts to track down dissidents, to question them and kill them. So again, not everyone fits neatly into one of these boxes or buckets. Most people have at least two, sometimes three motivations that drive them forward. But it's a handy way to think of security researchers. Now in 2013, 2014, Billy Rios, who's another security researcher, he tends to be driven by the protector as well as the patriot drive. He was looking at infusion pumps, taking those apart, and he found some what he considered fairly serious flaws. He reported them to the manufacturer, said, "I'll give you guys a year to fix this before I say anything to anyone else." He talked to the FDA. They got on the phone, made sure that everybody was on the same page, because these were things that could potentially harm human life. A few months later, after Billy, in a very coordinated manner, reported these to the security teams at this medical device maker, another researcher found a similar flaw or the same types of flaws in these devices, and published them online. Didn't find a way to report to the medical device maker, so just went public with them. And this set off a series of chain reactions. One of the first ones that it set off was it caused the medical device maker obviously to scramble. Press picked it up. Medical device maker was scrambling. The FDA was scrambling as well, because everybody was caught on their heels. They weren't ahead of the situation as they should have been. The FDA released a couple of notices. First, they released in, I believe it was May 2015, they released a safety notification about the PCA3, PCA5 devices. And then in July, late July, just before DEF CON started up, they released another one on Hospira's other devices. And the realization that they had after working with folks like Billy, who were going to give them plenty of ramp to do the right thing, is that not all researchers are like that. If you give a year to get a potential issue fixed or even addressed, you're buying time for adversaries, you're buying time for other researchers who aren't quite as mature, who maybe don't have the same motivations. So it really lit a fire under them, and they knew that they wanted to go out to industry and really work on improving things. So over the course of the next several years, even leading up to today, the FDA has been much more proactive in monitoring potential vulnerabilities, because they realize that the trust that gets kept or broken largely depends on being ahead of these types of issues and incidents. And when something new is discovered by a security researcher working in safe conditions, they want to make sure that it gets fixed really quickly. Now, one of the cases where, fortunately, we didn't have too many medical devices that were impacted by this, but if you remember WannaCry, which was a virus that swept around, particularly hard hit was the UK National Health Service in May 2017. This took down, I believe the stat was 30+% of NHS facilities were shuttered for a day or more. And that included, as I'm told, all of the stroke centers in the London area. So now we're gonna kind of bring it back around to the statistics, the data of the historical example, because one of the questions asked is, has anyone was anyone harmed in that? And generally, in talking with doctors and physicians, they say, no, of course not. We worked hard. We put in the extra time, the extra effort to make sure that there was not a clinical impact to patients. And that's true. I can't say enough about the good work that doctors do, that nurses do, that other caregivers and care providers do to protect their patients. They take a Hippocratic oath to act in the best interest of patients. And so they're going to go the extra mile to make sure that they can do all they can. But if you look on a statistical level, if you're John Snow, the John Snow from London in the 1800s, then you start to look at patterns and say, well, maybe doing all you can in a bad situation isn't quite enough. The bad situation takes precedence over the heroic efforts of single individuals. And so one of the things we did a little bit later that summer, 2017, is along with a bunch of doctors and some others, we put on the first ever CyberMed Summit. And the idea was we wanted to do clinical simulations where doctors go into a room and treat patients as they would in a real situation. But these patients are actors, or in this case, at a certain point, they transition to using mannequins because you can't do certain things on actors, right? You don't want to cut open an actor's chest to simulate what you would do to take some action against a malfunctioning pacemaker, for instance. And this was one of the exact scenarios that we gave. Is a pacemaker was malfunctioning, and it had a high side and a low side. So the high side, about every 60 seconds, was shocking this patient, and one of those shocks hit at just the right or the wrong time to send that patient into atrial fibrillation. Their heart stopped beating for a while. The doctor had to bring them back, and it happened again, and the doctor had to bring them back. Eventually, after the doctor tried all the methods that they knew how to try, they had to, with the advice of a cardiologist, open up the patient and snip the wires going to this patient's heart so that they wouldn't continue to die every time they brought him back. Then they hooked them up to an external pacer because, of course, the underlying physiology is that the patients still had heart issues. They had a slow heart rate. So they had to hook them up to an external pacing system. But going through this process, it was shocking to a lot of the other doctors who helped set it up. Obviously to the doctor who was undergoing this procedure, because they had always thought or heard or been told that no one's ever died from a hacked medical device. But in the debrief that we did afterwards, what we found is that, in a lot of cases, doctors don't look. They don't know how to look, or they don't know why they would look for a hacked device. They just think, oh, there's a malfunction, send it back to be reset, or, it must be defective, so send it back to the manufacturer, get rid of that device. If they do refer it for an investigation, the investigators aren't trained. They don't know how to look into these devices to see what's going on. And in a lot of cases, the data just doesn't exist. So the real question is, how would you even know if someone has died from a hacked medical device? And so this is what some of our doctor friends are now looking to do. They're looking to gather the evidence in a Jon Snow-like way in order to say whether or not people have died from cybersecurity issues. Maybe it's not a single smoking gun, but statistics over time that you can tell. Now, around the same time, the U.S. Health and Human Services issued a report on healthcare cybersecurity, and they said healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition. And I won't go over all of these, but this is on page 1 of the report, this graphic. You can go look into it. It's some really, really interesting facts and statistics. And they came out with a series of recommendations. Some of those are starting to be actioned now, which is great. The Health Sector Coordinating Council, led by Greg Garcia, is starting to take a lot of these recommendations, and has been for the last 3 or 4 years, in order to start working on fixing some of the systemic underlying issues within the healthcare system that lead to the healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition tag. So it's a really good start, but it's early yet. Secondly, as I already mentioned, we're building up this community, the Biohacking Village community, to bring different people together to work on these hard problems in the same room, to have a safe space to experiment, to learn, to teach others, and to work together alongside people that you normally wouldn't run into, that you normally wouldn't talk to. And this is a really, I think, monumental thing. If you look in this picture, you can see 2 members of the FDA, several medical device makers, security researchers, doctors. You can see a lot of people from different walks of life who are really helping to bring together all the disparate points of view so that we can be better. And in fact, in 2019, January, Scott Gottlieb, then FDA commissioner, came out and said, we want to see more medical device makers come out to DEF CON. And together we launched an initiative called We Heart Hackers. The idea being that if we can make the idea of engaging with hackers something more commonplace, then all of a sudden we're a lot better off as a community, as a healthcare community. And so some of the medical device makers, you see a set of 6 here, jumped up immediately, jumped on that, and we've been working with them. We're, again, in this era of COVID, we are working to get all of these medical device makers integrated into our virtual DEF CON events so that security researchers can test their devices or learn or, train the device makers on how security researchers look at these things. So there's a lot of good progress that we're making. Where are we going? And this is where it gets a little bit sci-fi. So as I like to say, the single biggest risk to the health of future generations is trust and trustworthiness of healthcare. And I really believe that to be true. There's a ton of amazing stuff going on, but if people don't trust it, if they turn away from it, then we put ourselves at risk. We put the health of our children and our grandchildren at risk. And if we look at the many great advances that are going on right now, I like to say there are multiple concurrent revolutions in healthcare. I don't think there's been anything like it potentially in the history of healthcare. I mean, maybe around the time of when penicillin and other medications like that started coming around. But even then, I don't think there was as much promise to solve as much potential underlying conditions as we have right now. So I want to highlight just quickly a couple of these that I think are absolutely fascinating. The first one is this idea of synthetic biology or regenerative medicine to be able to grow new parts. In talking with some device makers, they're literally growing things like ears in bioreactors, these external parts that are biocompatible with the person that they're going to be donated to make their lives better. And you can imagine, regrowing organs. So if you could regrow a liver in a dish or in a bioreactor, if you could regrow some other critical functions, you can dramatically reduce the number of people who are on the waiting list for these replacement organs. And there's just a ton of potential promise in this. This is one of the coolest things. This is a surgical robot that has sliced the skin off of a grape and is now tying sutures to close the skin up. This is absolutely amazing to me. I could watch this video. It's part of a much, much longer video. I could just watch it for hours at a time, looking at the intricacy of the movements. There's so much promise here. And so much of that promise is artificially intelligent, it's data-driven, it's code-controlled, it's hyper-connected. So it's dependent on these things that we have seen historically are undependable, unreliable. And I don't know how well this video is going to come across, but if you can imagine dropping a ball into a chamber where it sets off a chain reaction, this is one of the things that hyperconnectivity and software vulnerabilities bring to things. When you have a device that runs on software has vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities can be triggered when they're exposed to accidents and adversaries. And we're really starting to expose a lot more of these devices to accidents and adversaries for good reasons, right? Because we want to improve the knowledge of public health, because we want to make things better. We're starting to connect things up to each other, to network them together. We want to pull down meaningful use data and other things to improve population health. Well, it does, and it can do so meaningfully, but only if we protect them so that the potential isn't there for this type of a chain reaction. And distrust drives people to turn away from the best medical care possible. I was at a Heart Rhythm Society meeting a couple of years ago, and and talking about security of implanted medical devices. We had a doctor there who was on the advisory board of one of the medical device makers. We had another medical device maker there. And we're talking about these things. And in the Q&A session, one of the doctors stood up and said something along the lines of, you should be ashamed of scaring people about security issues. Repeated the old trope that, no one has ever died from a security issue. Made the very valid point that many, many people die from people not getting these devices. A nurse stood up from the VA hospital and said she had patients who needed implanted devices who wouldn't get them because they had been through military service and were paranoid that someone could assassinate them with these implanted devices. So it's not the potential for security issues, I believe, that makes people turn away. It's the not having the knowledge that they are safe and are built securely. When vulnerabilities and flaws are found, to not address them promptly or to address them in a way that doesn't fix the underlying issue. And this actually is what puts people at risk. It's the lack of knowledge. One of the projects that we're working on through CyberMed Summit with doctors, with bioethicists and others, is what might cyber-informed consent look like? What's the right amount of information to give to patients to make sure that they accept this new technology and don't run away from it? So let's look at some examples. And these are examples that already exist. There's a device that can do neural stimulation. It can stimulate the brain. It's implanted, and it's being used to treat things like PTSD, severe depression, bipolar disorder, and others. This is super cool technology. It's got the potential to just change a ton. But in talking with some of the doctors who are doing these studies, they found that patients are actually retuning and tweaking these devices to get themselves high. They're changing the frequency, or they're changing something about the treatment so that it releases endorphins or serotonin, dopamine, to just flood their brain with these hormones and get them high. That's not something that the doctors had trained for. That's not something they expected, but it's the reality. And if, of course, you can change it to get someone high, you can also change it to cause harm to someone, to stimulate greater PTSD, greater depression, greater bipolar disorder, to cause them to self-harm or to harm others. So, these things are a double-edged sword. This is a prosthetic patient. She was born without part of her arm, part of her left arm. And she's actually an actress and an archer. She was in the Hunger Games movie, where she was an archer in that. And she's got a really cool, fully articulating prosthetic hand. She 3D prints the sleeve for it that goes on her arm. And this is some really cool technology. But she's afraid of what might happen if it gets injured. If something happens to it, she can't use it. Will she have to go and get her hand fixed by the manufacturer who made it? Can she fix it herself? What happens when we're bringing these devices into ourselves? What happens at the forefront? She's also worried she won't come and speak at DEF CON because she's worried that somebody might hack this device. She's worried that it could cause harm to herself or someone else from the lack of security on it. And some of the basic things that she's found, she's not a security researcher, but she's found that accidentally it might sometimes trigger or make strange movements. And it runs on Bluetooth, and it has USB connectivity. It has all these forms of connectivity. It's running software. So again, software connected, potentially vulnerable, connected to the outside world through Bluetooth, and it's potentially exposed to accidents and adversaries. And there's a lawyer named Andrea Matwishin who's worked quite a bit on looking at the impacts of these future technologies. She calls her work the Internet of Bodies. She's got some good reads and some consumable formats. She's done a couple of op-eds on this, so you go check that out. And if anybody recognizes this guy, his name's Stuart Brand, and he's a really interesting person, environmentalist, and has done just a ton of work in a lot of different areas. He's one of the fathers of the computer revolution. He was hanging out with Steve Wozniak and a bunch of the other computer geeks out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he said in 1968, we were as gods, and we might as well get good at it. This was, what's that? Almost 50 years ago, and it's still true today. But in fact, I think that in reality, we are gods, and we must get good at it. It's no longer that we can just sit by and like London in the 1800s, continue to improve and increase our adoption of technologies, to race forward to the future in the same manner. We have to be conscious about how we're doing it. We shouldn't slow down unduly. We shouldn't stop progress or halt it. We just have to get better at doing it the right way. So again, I go back to this. I believe that the single biggest risk to the health of future generations is trust and trustworthiness of healthcare. All right, so what can we do about it? I've got a couple of more minutes to go here before we're going to open it up for questions. So I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but I want to highlight a few things. First and foremost, the FDA's pre-market and post-market guidance should be your roadmaps, especially the latest draft pre-market guidance that they put out. It's really good. It was built, again, with the help of security researchers, medical device makers, doctors, the reviewers, and others, to make sure that it strikes a good balance, to get the security side right without slowing down new devices coming out to market unduly. And if you want a very consumable read, I'd recommend the Hippocratic Oath for Connected Medical Devices. This is a document that we published in 2016 that essentially attempts to translate the original Hippocratic Oath into a modern setting. So just as doctors take a symbolic oath to act in the best interest of their patients, today, increasingly, care delivery is done by medical devices. So those devices should also be built, designed, deployed, operated with that same symbolic spirit. And there's a Journal of Medical Informatics Research article on this, going through some case studies of how to apply the Hippocratic Oath. And if you look, a lot of the details in this actually persist and pervade the pre-market and post-market guidance. So this is a philosophical level view of what to do. It's something that you could put in the hands of leadership, the CEO, the board of directors, so that they could directionally understand some of these cybersecurity, cyber safety concepts that you can then translate through the post-market, pre-market guidance. But this type of document can get you political support within your organizations. Another resource is if you go and check out this TED Talk, it's from 2014, and it's just as true today. Karen Al-Azhari says, hackers are the internet's immune system. Kind of going back to the motivations slide that we went through. Hackers aren't bad. They're just a different feature, a different function that a lot of times we're not used to. And they can actually help inoculate against future issues. And I want to point out this need for evidence capture to be built into medical devices. Because we don't have the ability to, in some cases, look into a device today and see what it can do, we have to build that capability into future devices so that we can go back in a privacy-preserving manner and check to see why a device behaved a certain way, to trace it back to a human fault, programming logic fault, or someone outside tampering with it, or some accident in the environment harming patients because of that. And then finally, there's a large, strong movement around software supply chain security, or specifically what's called a software bill of materials. This is something that is in the latest pre-market guidance from the FDA. It's also something that the NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Agency, is working on. They're a group within the Department of Commerce. And if you are not familiar with this, the concept is essentially a build list or an ingredients list of all the software that's in a device, so that you know when some new vulnerability is found out in the world that it impacts one of your components, you can more quickly assess the impact and take some action for it. And finally, I just want to say thank you for paying attention, for listening to this. I've got a lot of hope for the future of healthcare. At the same time, I realize that if we haven't solved problems in the relatively easy to solve domains that we're looking at today, it's exponentially harder to solve them in the farther out, less sure domains that we're looking at tomorrow. All of these potentially hugely beneficial types of medical devices, types of therapies that we can put into place, if we're not very cautious or diligent about how we develop new devices going forward, then I believe people will turn away from them. And I think that that's the worst thing that can possibly happen. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to the organizers for a Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Nina and Beau. We are gonna do a quick Q&A. Nina, if you wanna start your video again. Thank you. And then I see that you answered one of the questions in the chat. If you wanna do that verbally for us as well, that would be fantastic.
So I answered, but I also want Beau to answer. So the question is, do you have any insights on how the US cyber response in light of COVID-19 has compared to other countries? So my reply is, from my understanding only, there were a number of issues that the US medical device manufacturers were experiencing: phishing, ransomware, and nation state attacks. Some national and international universities and research centers that were looking for testing and vaccination and research experienced the same thing. And Latin, so Latin America, was also hit a bit as well for their universities and research centers. So Beau, if you have any other insight into that.
Yeah, there's been as Nina kind of mentioned, the CTI League, we've been tracking a lot of incidents, cybersecurity incidents that have happened. And there's an explosion of criminals who are essentially setting up COVID-related domains to scam people. And they're targeting hospitals in some of the work that they're doing. So one of the things that the League has been doing is trying to shut down those domains, trying to shut down those criminals, trying to work with hospitals and others who are potentially impacted, including the folks who are making the vaccines, making the test kits, making the ventilators. And there's a couple of different groups within the government, U.S. government, that are working on some of this with the hope that looking across the entire supply chain, they can work together with others to ensure that consistently you can get PPEs and tests and vaccines out to people once the vaccines are ready. I know that in at least the UK government, and I'm sure several others, there are similar endeavors.
The other question comes from Bill Hagestad from Medtronic. So he wrote, what is the relevance to medical device cybersecurity here? I have a couple of notes. While you were having your talk, I wrote some things down. So for me, I'm really bad at broad answers. So I gave a broad question, so I gave a really broad answer. So reshoring, so what does this actually entail for us? This is, aside from the human resources of training, education, pay, there's DEP laws for waste that we need to recalculate if we're going to bring everything back, resources for devices, plastic, metal, and components, also IP, nationally, how we work those, and international. As far as cyber is concerned, the cybers, we need to do this uniformly better So start to finish, it has to be completely all-inclusive, from the EMR to the devices to smaller components and how things interact and communicate with each other, as well as working together more broadly rather than just as a company. It should also be the industry, the makers, the citizen scientists. And something that I have been considering for quite a bit of time. The FDA has a project that they've been working on called SIMSAB, so Cybersecurity Medical Advisory Board, Strategic Advisory Board. I think that is a really beautiful platform for maybe getting this together. I believe that it needs to be funded, so that may be one of the initiatives that should start to happen so that we can get the people we need at the same table at the same time and have the broad and hard discussions. Over to you, Beau.
Yeah, and Bill, to your question, I noticed that came in at 10:20 as I was probably going through the very historical information, which may have been too deep a dive, but I geek out over it. Hopefully, I brought it back around and showed that just because something is small or invisible doesn't mean it can't cause harm, and that what we need is to really look at start looking at the evidence, start gathering the evidence so we can be able to look at it, start reaching outside or being open to listening to folks who are outside the healthcare medical device establishment for some of their observations, and rectifying and reconciling those with the observations from inside traditional healthcare. So it's not that any one perspective is necessarily untrue, but that multiple perspectives put together can lead to a deeper truth or a deeper understanding of the same truth.
And just as an aside, I can't answer anything else in the Q&A because there's nothing in there. But if you want to get in contact with us to have further discussions, we're always happy and open to doing such a thing. So I don't know if the organizers can put our emails up or give those out later, but that would be
we can definitely do that.
okay.
And if you do have any other questions, feel free to submit those. We'll wait a couple more minutes before we close out. But if you do have any other questions for Beau or Nina, please add those to the Q&A right now. And if there's any other last minute comments that you guys have as well, feel free to voice those.
I'm going to do 2 sentences. There's just a lot to learn right now as far as COVID is concerned for us as individual humans and us as a conglomerate worldwide. So I think this is one of those opportunities where not only do we get to learn about the metal that we're made of, it's also the metal that the rest of the world is made of and how we come together during this and after. So again, I love Q&A, private time with people. I will argue and question everything you say so that we can get to a foundational truth and build up from there.
All right, Beau, any last comments?
I think this has been a wonderful opportunity. So thank you to DMD, thank you to Archimedes, and we hope to see a lot of more folks who are interested and eager to get involved in some of this research and come to the Biohacking Village at DEF CON. villageb.io is how you can reach us. We also have a podcast, White Hats and Lab Coats, whitehatslabcoats.org.
All right, we'll post all that information on the cybersecurity page, the session page. And Bill, if you're ready, we'd like to have Bill Arts, the Executive Director of the Archimedes Center, give a few closing words. If you're ready, Bill. You might need to unmute yourself.
hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, good, thanks. I felt like I was lost out in the ocean there for a minute. Thanks for the intro. This is Bill Arts. I'm the Executive Director of Archimedes. Just a quick thank you and a small plug for Archimedes in this. Number of thank yous. Beau, it's good to see you, and thank you for participating. Your beard is looking better than ever. And Nina, always good to see and hear you. Thanks for joining us. It had been a while since we talked, but I want to thank these guys. These are really top flight people in all of the medical device security world. And so it's a pleasure to have them. I also want to thank our partnership with University of Minnesota and the DMD conference. They've been good partners. And we want to continue to be with them. So hopefully, DMD will get some additional activity because of this. Just a short plug for Archimedes. We partnered with DMD to do this. Those of you that are members, that belong to companies that are members of Archimedes, and hopefully you know if you are one, we're also going to have a series of 4 additional webinars coming up, and hopefully you've gotten information about that already, or might have today. We just sent out our Archimedes Circle, our newsletter of sorts today that has the information on how to join the rest of those webinars. Probably a bit similar in format, but with a nice variety of speakers, including some of our members. If you're not a member of Archimedes, please feel free to let us know, and we'd be happy to give you information about how your company can become a member. With that, I don't want to take up anybody else's time. Thank you for the very good morning. We appreciate all of you, especially those that were listening in. And I bid you a good day. I think that should be the end.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.